Handful of Dust is a novel by Evelyn Waugh, published in 1934. A Handful of Dust is from the third-person omniscient narrator and is a tragedy novel wrapped in satire and dark comedy of manners depicting the domestic drama of rich characters living in 20th century England. Before we begin, do like and subscribe. John Beaver is a 25-year-old living with his mother in London, where she rents out apartments. After graduating from Oxford, John worked at an advertising agency until the economic crisis hit, leaving him unemployed. He spends his days waking up late and waiting by the phone, hoping for dinner invitations, which often come at the last minute. This weekend, he plans to visit Tony Last, a new acquaintance, at Hetton Abbey, the Last family's ancestral estate in the English countryside. Tony receives a telegram from Beaver and, wanting a quiet holiday with his wife Brenda and son John Andrew, isn't thrilled about the visit. He leaves Brenda to entertain the guest. Tony dreams of restoring the old estate to its former glory, despite the Last family's reduced wealth compared to Hetton's peak. Tony does not notice his wife's boredom, her hatred of the estate, or his son's growing waywardness. Brenda finds Beaver charming and starts to like him. She wants to find an apartment in London, and Beaver's mother helps her. Brenda soon realizes she is attracted to John Beaver. When Brenda goes to London with her sister Marjorie, they visit a restaurant owned by a mutual friend, where they meet Mrs. Beaver and Lady Cockpurse. Lady Cockpurse invites them to a party in a few days. When Brenda asks Beaver to accompany her to the party, he makes an awkward excuse to avoid the expense, which upsets Brenda. The following day, Beaver sends a telegram saying he's free to go to the party, delighting Brenda. Despite Beaver's protests, Brenda pays for lunch at a restaurant. On the way to the party, she kisses Beaver in the backseat of a taxi. The following day, all of London is abuzz with the news that Brenda and Beaver are having an affair. For 3 days, Brenda returns to Hetton, but using the excuse of needing to deal with apartment issues, she heads back to London. She calls Tony in the morning and evening but spends a lot of her time with Beaver. Under the guise of wanting to take women's economics courses at the university, Brenda stays more in London. One day, Tony unexpectedly visits London. Unhappy with his surprise visit, Brenda claims to be too busy to see him. Tony goes to his club and, along with his friend Jock Grant Menzies, gets quite drunk, spending the evening repeatedly calling Brenda, which angers her. Back at Hetton, Tony argues with his son. John Andrews, missing his mother, bombards his exhausted father with questions. Brenda brings friends to Hetton for 2 weekends subsequently. Feeling guilty, she hopes Tony will develop an interest in her new friend Jenny Abdul Akbar, a free-spirited but pleasant woman who was once married to a black man. However, Tony finds her tiresome. One day, while Brenda is away typically, a hunting event is organized in the Hetton forest. John Andrew, knowing how to ride a pony, is allowed to attend. After the hunt starts, he is sent home under Ben's care. On the way back, Miss Ribbon's unruly horse gets scared, rears up, and strikes John with its hoof. The boy falls into a ditch and dies. Jock Grant Menzies, who witnessed the hunting accident, travels to London to inform Brenda about her son's death. Brenda, attending a party at the time, is devastated by the news. After the funeral, she quickly leaves Hetton and writes Tony a letter from London, declaring that she won't return, that she loves Beaver and that she wants a divorce. To protect Brenda's reputation, he negotiates the divorce by pretending he was unfaithful and agreeing to pay her a yearly stipend. Tony needs witnesses to his supposed affair, so he hires Millie, a bar girl, and goes with her to Brighton, followed by detectives. Millie brings her daughter, who constantly annoys him. Back in London, Tony has a tense conversation with Brenda's brother Reggie, who demands alimony twice what Tony can afford and for which Tony would have to sell Hetton. Complicating matters, the detective's testimony is worthless since Millie's daughter was present in Tony's room, invalidating the affair. Tony tells Brenda he will finalize the divorce upon his return from his travels but clarifies that he will not provide her with any financial allowance. Tony decides to escape and joins an expedition to Brazil in search of a lost civilization. On his journey, Tony is accompanied by Dr. Messenger, a young researcher. During their voyage to South America, Tony meets Teresa de Vitry, a girl returning to Trinidad after studying in Paris for 2 years. They have a brief affair, but Teresa loses interest upon discovering Tony is married. After landing in Brazil, Tony and Dr. Messenger interact with local Indians, enduring swarms of insects while hoping for guidance to the lost Shining City. The Indians build boats for them but abandon them after delivering them to the edge of the Paiwi tribe's territory. Tony and Dr. Messenger continue downstream alone. Tony falls ill with a high fever and becomes unconscious for many days. The inept Dr. Messenger ventures alone to seek help but drowns in a waterfall. Tony makes it to an Indian village, where he meets Mr. Todd, an old Englishman who loves hearing books read aloud. Mr. Todd claims to be illiterate but owns a Charles Dickens collection left by his missionary father. He leads a small indigenous tribe in the Amazon. Mr. Todd nurses Tony back to health but forces him to stay and read aloud the books constantly. Tony has lived in Todd's hut for nearly a year. One day, Mr. Todd drugs Tony and, upon waking, informs him that he told some European searchers that Tony had died, giving them Tony's watch as proof. Trapped, Tony realizes he will spend the rest of his life in the village. In England, news of Tony's official death results in Hetton Abbey passing to his cousins. Meanwhile, Brenda is abandoned by Beaver when he realizes Tony wouldn't provide a financial settlement in the divorce. Brenda, believing herself a widow, marries Jock Grant Menzies, while Tony's will leave Hetton Abbey to his relatives. The remaining members of the last family gather at Hetton, where they have built a memorial for Tony on the estate. Teddy, one of the relatives, looks over his family with pride and affection, hoping to one day restore Hetton to the glory it had during Tony's time. Let's analyze A Handful of Dust. A Handful of Dust explores the parallel decline of a marriage and a fragment of English society, highlighting post-World War I changes in England. Tony clings to his ancestral estate, while Brenda is drawn to the modern allure of London. Tony's complacency in his outdated lifestyle leaves him unprepared for his son's death and his wife's betrayal. In an attempt to reinvent himself as a daring adventurer, Tony loses control of both his estate and his freedom. Brenda's pursuit of sexual liberation proves unsustainable, as she struggles with the burden of self-support after leaving her marriage. Through concise dialogue and sharp descriptions, Waugh depicts a world lacking duty and commitment, where life and death barely disturb the docile surface of a complacent society. Affluent Londoners sympathize with the manipulative Brenda and blame the hurt Tony for their troubles. Tony's helplessness and passive complicity contribute to his own downfall. Brenda ruthlessly pursues her own goals of wealth and pleasure, indifferent to her son's death and her husband's heartbreak. Conceited and petty, she prioritizes her own happiness above all else. John Andrew, her son, and even Beaver, her lover, are quickly forgotten as she dreams of a new life, one she couldn't have with Tony. Brenda's infatuation with London's superficial glamour is obvious in her affair with John Beaver. Her shallowness is clear when she barely mourns her son's death and quickly leaves Tony for her lover. When Tony is presumed dead, Brenda finds herself neither divorced nor widowed, with John Beaver more interested in her money than in her. Tony, representing a civilized Englishman, is contrasted with the primal self-indulgence of Brenda and the crass aristocrat Lady Cockpurse, who enjoy hedonistic indulgences without accepting the responsibilities of their privileged status. Tony Last's treasured ancestral home, Hetton Abbey, is an outdated carbuncle from a dim era in British history. Rebuilt in 1864 in the Gothic style, the county guidebook now dismisses it as devoid of interest. Each bedroom has a brass bedstead and a mural of Gothic text, with names taken from Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. Tony has slept in the Morgan Le Fay room since he left the nursery, while his wife, Brenda, occupies the Guinevere room. Hetton Abbey exemplifies the futility of modernizing a historical relic to meet contemporary yardsticks, which it cannot uphold. Tony, who is never happy away from Hetton, is like a jailbird in his own home. His love for it is so intense that Brenda mocks him as madly futile, ridiculing both him and his beloved house. Tony's attempts to modernize Hetton are as useless as previous efforts to change it from a medieval Catholic abbey to a Victorian Gothic revival, leaving it and Tony himself devoid of any authentic individuality, both relics out of time. Tony Last was excessively attached to the past. He felt pretty bored at Hetton but knew he couldn't find joy elsewhere. He had developed a habit of loving and trusting Brenda and of staying at Hetton, rarely leaving even for brief visits to old friends. While Tony clung to the past with the King Arthur-themed rooms, Brenda wanted to modernize them with a trendier style. Tony's desperate hold on the past ultimately led to his destruction and he only came to value his freedom after he had lost it. Tony last embodies the lost religious faith of English society. Tony loves church-going and adheres to religious practices as part of the venerable Hetton tradition, a refuge from the modern world. His faith, though sincere, is more about tradition than true Christian belief. The landed gentry, including Tony, exemplify the upper class's hollowness and pretense. They attend church but ignore sermons recycled from the minister's colonial days. For them, liturgy is just part of their genteel lifestyle. As Tony goes through the motions of worship, his thoughts drift, often to practical concerns like adding more bathrooms to Hetton. Brenda's immorality and indifference to her son's death, along with her affair with Beaver, reflect Waugh's disillusionment with modern sensibilities that discard traditional values and are devoid of faith. When Brenda doesn't get the divorce settlement she expected, her lover leaves. To find purpose, Tony journeys to the Amazon. The jungle he becomes lost in symbolizes the meaninglessness of a life without God. He falls into oblivion, unmissed and unremembered by those from his former life. Hope you comment, share and subscribe for more videos.